If there's one word in psychiatry guaranteed to create misunderstanding and even fear among lay people, it's psychosis. This is partly because of the media's insistence on confusing psychosis with psychopathy, but partly because it's so unlike most people's experiences, or at least it appears to be. Add to this the strangeness of the various diagnoses that crop up in discussion of psychosis. You have a recipe for confusion that's hard to overestimate. The word psychosis is just a term to describe certain experiences or symptoms. Psychotic symptoms come in three broad groups, which are hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorders. Different diagnoses are made based upon which of these three symptom groups are present, how long they've been an issue for the person, and what other types of symptom might also be present. Perhaps the most well-known of the psychotic disorders is schizophrenia, but there are many others. You may have heard of bipolar affective disorder, drug-induced psychosis, psychotic depression, puerperal psychosis, and delirium. None of these diagnoses automatically means axe-wielding murderer. That's just the myth that certain trashy newspapers use to boost their sales. They take relatively rare tragedies and blow them out of all proportion to generate headlines like schizophrenic kills baby in crazed psychotic rampage. What they don't report are the more common experiences of people diagnosed with psychotic disorders. After all, a headline like "Psychotic woman sits staring at the wall for 15 hours a day" probably wouldn't sell many newspapers. Over the next few videos, we'll consider the true meanings of hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorders. Hallucinations may occur in any sense or modality, that's auditory, visual, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile. Modality just means sense. Auditory hallucinations are by far the most common. Hallucinations are positive symptoms because they represent something more than the norm. They're an additional experience that most other people don't share. Think of the plus sign you first learned in school. That's also the symbol for positive. Positive symptoms are additions to the norm. Auditory hallucinations are usually experienced as voices, whether familiar or unfamiliar, that are perceived as different from a person's own thoughts. This idea of different from thought is important, and we'll pick up on it later. The voice in your head, the internal chatter of thought you experience all day long, is not an hallucination. Hallucinatory voices are experienced as though they come from a source outside of you. You hear them through your ears, or at least that's how it seems. The voices might represent several different entities or just one. They may be nice or nasty, and they may speak directly to you or simply talk amongst themselves. Some people hear voices telling them what to do. These are called command hallucinations. Interestingly, voices often seem to mirror a person's mood, just as your thoughts mirror yours. If you're feeling happy, the voices will tell you positive things. If you're feeling sad or insecure, the voices will tell you how useless you are or how pointless it is trying to achieve anything. This is what we mean when we talk about mood-congruent hallucinations. The voices match the mood. Many people are in no doubt that, however they may seem, hallucinations are their own thoughts. This is extremely significant because it gives them ownership of their hallucinations and therefore control over them. After all, everyone has thoughts they don't feel particularly proud of or that they wouldn't be comfortable sharing with others. When considered in this light, hallucinations become no more of a problem than any other thought and equally open to control, admittedly with a bit of training and practice. for me. One of the most interesting aspects of hallucinations is the way that society interprets them. For example, daytime television in UK is full of psychic mediums who claim to hear voices from beyond the grave. And on the whole, society accepts this as somehow more plausible than the experience of a teenager who hears the voice of his late grandparent. We see one of these people as gifted and the other as insane. But is there really any difference? It seems to me that mediums, channelers, voice-hearing priests and the patient in your local acute ward all occupy one of the same three possible categories. Either they're psychotic, or they're really genuinely in touch with something outside of normal understanding, or they're lying. Of course, different people will have different opinions based upon their particular preferences and bias, but that's not really the point. If we call any of these experiences psychotic, we must also acknowledge that there is just as much or as little evidence to say the same about the rest. This is equally true if we decide that they're deceitful, or even that they truly are gifted. There's an interesting cultural and even subcultural perspective here. For example, some African cultures are much more likely to accept voice hearing in a religious context than more traditional Western churchgoers might. With all these cultural influences to take into consideration, it becomes extremely difficult to say what is and is not an hallucination in any medical sense, when so many people claim otherwise. I know an ordained priest who's told me on more than one occasion about conversations with God and with Satan, the latter being a less than welcome intruder. This priest is adamant that these conversations happened, or at least they were the last time we discussed it. As an atheist, I have a rather different perspective on the whole affair, but then, who cares what I might think? However, if you are interested in what I think, then keep listening and I'll tell you. I think that my opinion should be less important to the person experiencing hallucinations than their own ability to deal with them. If they choose to believe in conversations with some ill-defined spirit and that helps them to cope, then so be it. Who cares what I might think? After all, if TV mediums can find a place in the world, then so can anyone else. What interests me is not imposing my own interpretation of someone's experience, but in helping them to function in whatever worldview they choose. To that end, I might talk to them about their interpretation, but it remains their interpretation that matters, not mine. After all, many of the chief religious and political figures across the world, from Saul of Tarsus to Joan of Arc and even, allegedly, Tony Blair, achieved their status precisely because of experiences such as this. However, let's not get too carried away normalizing psychosis and hallucinations. It's true that many people cope very well, but others do not. The majority of voice hearers we see in health and social care settings are very likely to be in the distressed camp. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be working with them. These people are not the much-feted psychic mediums and spiritual healers of the world. They are the struggling individuals who have not found a way to integrate their experiences into society's acceptable mainstream. And we would do them a great disservice by pretending otherwise. Distressed voice hearers may well need our help, and it's up to us to try so far as we are able to provide that help as part of a larger multidisciplinary team. Treatments and interventions for hallucinations vary. The traditional medical approach is to try and remove them altogether using medication. Unfortunately, although medication can work extremely well for some people, it isn't always effective. Sometimes all antipsychotic medications do is dampen down a person's thinking and energy levels until they lose all quality of life. For others, the medications cause severe side effects that are extremely difficult to cope with. In some cases, they're irreversible. Yet medication has its place, and it can work wonders. It's always worth considering antipsychotics, but if they don't do the trick, if they don't solve the problem, that doesn't mean that there are no other options. Many people function extremely well with their hallucinations, sometimes because of their hallucinations. Some people achieve great things precisely because they hear voices and see visions. These people have a lot to teach us about how to help the people in our care. Many argue that it's not the fact that you hear voices or see visions that's the problem, it's the way you think about those voices and visions that matters. Marius Rom and Sondra Escher founded the Hearing Voices Network decades ago to help people learn how to understand and deal with their voices constructively. There are many techniques that can be used with genuinely interesting results. I'm Stuart Sorensen. You can find me at www.mindthecaretraining.com. Do please go over there and have a look. And while you're at it, before you leave YouTube, please like and share this video. It really does help me an awful lot when people do that. Thank you for watching.